The story I'll be reading here today is called Fall of Valroona, Book 1 of Many, by my dear friend Tiberious JC. Chapter 1, Reborn. In a grove of splendor, an oasis in the middle of a desolate land, tucked inside a small group of rocks big enough to conceal a small paradise, but not so big to warrant anyone to find shelter or investigate. Inside these small rock formations, wisteria rise as pillars, arcing up to the center of a great dome. Twisting and entangling these grand wisterias to a seemingly impenetrable structure, ostensibly a completely natural and freakishly strange happenstance, which to an untrained eye one would be in such awe of its intrinsic design, they would forget even the slightest thought. Some to the point of forgetting everything they had ever learned, leaving them in a childlike state of total wonderment. It's told that there was a man who had once found the wonderment after 2 moons lost in the desert, living on anything he could get his hands on, the vilest of substances thinkable, a list of most wretched things a human could eat, so much so that I myself don't have the stomach to even mention. On purest and most stalwart of survival instincts, he was able to survive. With a storm hitting hard, and so beaten down was he when he stumbled upon the oasis, with the magnificence was merely lost on him. Instead of just standing in shock, he seemed to be drawn toward it, as though someone or something was lifting him up, making it possible to move his half-broken body practically as if there was nothing wrong at all. He found himself standing in front of what could only be a doorway, his body blistered from exposure of heat and elements, and bloody from fighting spiny bush and sharp-fanged animals in the fight for survival. He fell forward, catching himself on a sharp, blade-like branch, his blood covering the door. In that instant, as if giving a part of himself so willingly, the door gently, gracefully opened, collapsing to the ground inside, laboriously rolling over to his back. He tried to get some sort of sense of his surroundings. A street aroma surrounded him, and he drifted off to sleep. The man must have been asleep for a long time, for when he awoke, he was completely healed. Gaining his senses, he was overcome with the level of moisture in the air. He thought to himself that he must have somehow drunk the air to regain his strength. It must be so. As he sat up, he was covered in moss and vine, like a blanket had covered him. Standing up, he noticed his clothing was now comprised of this vegetation, and it seemed as though tailored to fit. His strength was renewed. Looking around what seemed a vast forest, sweet smells and a cool wet breeze flowed around him, causing his stomach to grumble. In front of him, an apple tree of some sort of golden red fruit overburdened the tree, and he thankfully helped himself to the bounty. As he ate, he noticed other vegetation. He recognized onions, olives, grapes, figs, and a few others that, though he didn't recognize, it seemed as though he instinctually knew what would be good for him. Knowledge not before known to him, among the trees and rolling mounds of moss, he explored his new world. Shane walked through the woods. As he walked, the animals had no fear of him, and oddly enough, they had no fear of each other. Strange, he said to himself, time and time again once, when a bear and a deer walked by as though for an evening walk. Or was it morning? Afternoon? He couldn't get a bearing of the time of day, what week, month, or year it was. There was only the woods. What was this place? 5 years he lived there, learning the ways of the ancient nature. It seemed as though to him that there wasn't a single plant or animal that wasn't represented from the world he came from, and so much more. One morning he was walking and talking, taking mental notes as to what he saw and what could be helpful in different circumstances. For some reason, he went down a path he must have passed a dozen times yet not noticed. It gave way to a clearing. This clearing was a deep pond. In the middle of this pond was a small island. On that island was what seemed to be a beautifully crafted pedestal. There was an object on the pedestal. As though in a trance, he walked across the pond, to the island and up to the pedestal, which at closer inspection was a live tree grown in the shape of what it appeared to be. Upon this ornate tree was a book, or an orb. History was given different items as to what it was. Some say it was a spirit of the world that sat upon it. Being a traditionalist, I prefer a book. A big book woven and written by the will of the world to one day teach a worthy man to be the champion of nature and bring balance to the world once again. As he read, the knowledge held within poured into his being. For 15 years he learned this new knowledge as though he were the one that had written the book himself. On the last day of the 15th year, he had finished the book with all the knowledge within himself, and when he closed the book, it dissolved, seemingly into his hands. On that day, nature had nothing more to teach him. He knew everything that could be learned. On that day, the wisest of all beings in the forest came forward, with a grand robe of the most luscious forest green imaginable. It seemed to blend with its surroundings with a deep hood and inside pockets that seemed to be endless in their capacity to hold things. The wise one walked with him a while, being 15 feet tall and covered in bark, giving one to think she a tree. The wise one told the man it was time for him to go out into the world and bring back balance to the world. From now on, you will be known as Shane the Green. When you are done with your venture and all is as it should be, you may come back home. At that, Green left his home to do his best to bring the world back to its natural glory. End of chapter 1. Fall of Valroona, Book 1 of Many, by my dear friend Tiberious JC, Chapter 2, Choice. Across the world, stories were starting, many lives not knowing what roles they would yet play as future history began to show itself. What choices will be made, and to what end will this world find itself? Oddly enough, the catalyst that would bring these people together would not be that of Green, but of that from a child. Every move each of the future groups would bring them to only one place, a city of lights. One so bright it blinded one to how evil it truly was. Of course, evil is only perceived by those who would have thought evil brought upon them. Shane the Green walked what seemed years through valleys, vales, hills, mountains, oceans, rivers, deserts, and plains, through summers, falls, winters, and springs. As he wandered, stories began to travel, seemingly faster than he. As he traveled, he did lend a hand at various farms for perhaps a dry place to sleep, and a well-prepared meal. He always thought that exquisite meal was most likely the best thing nature had ever bestowed upon the human race. And he wasn't ever bashful in stating the fact that when the meal was exceptionally good, a few times he stayed just a bit longer, always stating that maybe just one more meal. Thus he would stay for another day's work in the fields. Those who were blessed with a visit would notice after Shane the Green had left that while he was there, the land seemed to flourish. And once he was gone, the place would seem dull and commonplace. And would produce what was expected. Shane would teach those who would listen for better ways of tending the land, ways that would not only double their harvest, but would ensure the land to never get tired or barren. As word traveled, Shane the Green seemed to run into more and more men that not only expected him to stay and help their farm, but demanded it of him. The final instance he had with an individual was one of a man and his men for which the previous was exactly described. Dorn, the man of obvious power of his area, found Green resting himself under what was, unfortunately, Dorn's tree. In Green's naivete, he openly introduced himself as himself. Immediately, Green was taken by no other means than a forced invitation to join him to dinner at his home. Green, knowing he was most defiantly in a position not to decline, went along with the abrupt invitation to dinner. After what was most defiantly one of the most hideously tasting slop ever tried to be passed as food, Green was pushed into the barn with no doubt his self-imposed and self-important host had guards at all the exits. Green, being removed from the world, had forgotten the treachery of man. I was quickly remembering how he came to a desert so many years ago. Flashback. He disagreed with the treatment of a woman from his own tribe. The woman was a keeper of the eldest house. One night, the head of the house, that is, the head of the tribe, had pushed his wants upon the woman. She, being of honest and loyal stock, would not and could not disgrace her man. A fight ensued which had spilled into the street. She was much more than what he had thought she was. Fire and lightning surrounded her as he beat her. She fought back, nearly killing the elder. At the end, due to just a moment's lapse of focus, he stood over her dead, burnt body. Her husband was home at the farm, tending to the crops, the livestock, and children. That night, the husband at the farm tucked the children in for the night and did his nightly rounds, checking the pastures for beasts that may endanger the farm and family. He was becoming more and more anxious as to where his wife could have gone. She should have been home hours ago. By the time he had finished his rounds, he was most definitely concerned and aggravated by her absence. At that moment, he smelled smoke. Looking in the direction of his house, he saw it ablaze. Screaming, he ran with all his worth to save his family. He reached them just in time to hear the screams stop, and nothing but silent and the crackle of fire in the air. He collapsed to his knees, emotions pushing him to an almost catatonic state. 6 men rode up to him on their horses and beat him to darkness. When he awoke, he found himself in a cell, one he recognized as the local dungeon. It wasn't a dungeon by fact, but a simple adobe building lined with metal bars. He recognized it so well for the fact he was the one who had designed and built it. While getting his bearings, he heard a voice, which was most likely the reason why he had woken up. It was his cousin calling his name. He responded, "Tara, is that you? What in the name of all is going on? Last I remembered is trying to save my children from a fire, then being surrounded by the elders, men, and being beaten nearly to death. I don't understand. Where is my wife?" She refused to give herself to the Grand Elder, Tara replied. A fight. Then she found herself dead. What? For his treachery, he kills my entire family. This will not do. You will be tried and killed by the end of the day. No, I will not, he said. Tara pleaded to her cousin to escape, but he refused to do so. He told her to leave before the elder's wrath fell upon her. After some more arguments, she left. That night, he was brought before the elders. He stood there in silence as they read off a long list of things they said he did, and with each reading, the township became more unrestrainable. The people began to protest in his favor. Everyone in town is behind you, Shane. All you have to do is say the word. We are with you. Shane was so remorse with the loss of his loved ones, he just stood there in silence. The Council of Elders, realizing that Shane was held in much higher regard than they had ever thought anyone would be under their people. To appease the now unruly mob, the council had the guards take him back to the dungeon so they could consult the oracles. That night after eating, Shane fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, Shane was very warm. Stretching a bit, he felt that there was something different about the bed he fell asleep on. He griped with both hands what seemed to be sand. He opened his eyes, looking around. He found himself in a desert. Drugged, he exclaimed. Those asses drugged me. Not only do they take everything from me, they take my world. Defeated and alone, he roams the desert. Flashback back to the present. Back in the barn, Green assessed the situation, saying to himself, after all this time, I must be mad to think mankind could be trusted. Yet here I am doing my part to bring back the world to balance. Perhaps I've been going about this all wrong. Perhaps I should be living in the wild, bringing the wild back to its former glory, not the glory of mankind. At that, Green went to the back of the barn. Now to leave this place. In the back he found a great store of seeds, much more than that of one farm. Seems someone's greed has spread to his neighbors. He wants his plan to grow, well, then he's got it. I call upon the four winds to bring the rain of prosperity for these poor seedlings, children of the earth, be born and grow to all your worth this night. Winds shook the barn, roofing splintered, rafters lifted, the roof ripped clean from the barn, and a torrential rain down pouring, not before seen in this land. The men that were guarding him ran home. In Dorn's house, the family was holding tight to each other, all claiming to not know what had brought this upon him, praying to their God, and then finally blaming Green for their misfortune. A few moments later, great cracks and thunder from the ground came rushing down the valley. Dorn, with the most sickened look on his face, exclaimed, "The dam has gone!" Just then, a wave of water hit the house and smashed the barn with such force that even Green was taken surprise. During all this, all the seeds had germinated and were growing at expeditious rate. Green reached for some corn stalks without a word. He was cocooned in vegetation. Up he was lifted, kept atop the water, and was spared the fate of the ones left below. Green was washed on to a hill, what at this time was but a small island. The vegetation that had surrounded him took root in the ground and let him free. Walking to the top of the hill and watched through the darkness what he had done, with almost a dismissive tone to his voice, he spoke softly. Pity. Hours passed, and just as the light had turned a dark pale, giving hint of a new day rising, getting lighter, the sky danced with colors, purple, teals, giving into pink, then orange and red. The sun began to rise behind him. He stood up, letting the light filter through him to the land below. His shadow cast more light than the sun itself. It covered the entire valley. He stretched out his arms. Once the sun rose above his head, he looked down on the valley. It was as though humans had never set foot there. with the exception of an overabundance of food and trees now growing. It was so peaceful, so quiet. At that thought, a deer nuzzled his hand. He knelt down, stroking its head. It's all yours. No animal will be hurt here. Shane the Green stood and looked around. He was surrounded by all sorts of beasts. This is your land, my family. Yours, and yours alone. Go in peace. With that, all the animals walked and crawled, slithered, and flew to their new home. Shane the Green turned his back on his own kind that day. He lost everything because of their treacherous ways. They took his family, his freedom, and his goodwill towards them. He would look after his new family, all of nature kind and not that of humankind. He was never seen again by another human, but for stories of a mysterious man like a beast that protected all the forests wherever he went, seemingly a specter of some sort, and everywhere he seemed to show the forests of the areas would go feral, growing dark, thick, and deadly for men to enter. The animals that once were food and afraid became seemingly organized. Rumor arose that a great beast of lore was rejuvenating his kingdom, bringing back the former glory of the animal and plant kingdoms, back to the days when humans cowered together in the night, too afraid to enter the forests, even during the day. There were sympathizers that believed that it was good, that nature was finally taking a stand, that the people of the world had abused their abilities and took too much without repaying what they took. The old ways are returning. Wizards, sorcerers, and druids once dwindled to nothing more than cheap tricksters and snake oil salesmen began to gain power. Those few that actually believed in the old ways and had an affinity for using these gifts would quickly rise to amaze and do the most wondrous things. End of chapter 2. Fall of Valroona, Book 1 of many by my dear friend Tiberious J.C., Chapter 3. New World. A rare sight one would see on a day such as this, Darren said to his young apprentice. A sight not that strange, sir, it's just a flock of birds. Darren chuckled. Boy, he said, you may have knowledge hidden for even yourself. Off in the distance, a dark cloud was moving quickly towards them. As it got closer, the sound of at least 1,000 ravens' wings beating the air in what seemed in perfect time, not unlike a quick march of an army on their way to battle. Very strange indeed, said Darren. Not one of them made a single caw or vocalism whatsoever. We must hasten our travels, boy. Come, boy. Trouble's afoot. Don't you mean trouble's a wing, sir? The boy said, running up from behind. Don't start with me, boy. Now's not the time for jokes. Darren couldn't help but crack a smile, and perhaps a small laugh, and gave the boy a thoughtless wink, which gave the boy a solace, knowing that though it wasn't time to be light-hearted, even Darren couldn't help himself at the boy's timing on his words. They ran for what seemed a day, stopping just long enough for food and drink. When night fell, they made camp without fire. Darren didn't want any undue attention. The next day was another long run. Sometime after midday, they came to a great wall, or at least at one time it was great, now overgrown and crumbling under the weight of the vegetation that covered it. Huge hinges, frozen in rust, shone what unimaginably tall doors they were. One could make out their thickness from marks left on the stone from whence they rested. Sir, what would have inspired men to build such magnificently large and what seem endless walls such as these? Darren looked at the boy. I guess you are ready for the story of our ancestors. Let's walk a bit. I have a feeling that we may be to our destination sooner than we are needed. Story time. Eons ago, the world was ruled by men. Magic and the ways of the world today were not but stories of fantasy. It was a world of science, ruled by greed. The Great Mother fell sick, and this world could no longer support life. The people of that time had a complete understanding of the entire universe. Many of them had left this world on great ships and flew off into the stars above. Those who stayed were decrepit, old, infirm. And yet some stayed behind believing that they could fix it all. They formed a group, a gathering of the most brilliant people left on the planet. As the world continued to grow weaker, the people found that their technology was what was destroying their environment. Those who could went out and explored the world for what small patches of life they could find, try and live in harmony with the earth, sky, and water. What was left of it, that is. There was a split between the humans that embraced nature and those who fought to stay alive with their technology. Battles broke out between the Techs and the Greens over resources, further destroying the natural balance. Towards the end, all seemed lost, but for one small group. There was a gathering of Greens who believed that Tech could live in harmony with nature. Perhaps it could enhance it, to help it, to somehow combine the two. Stories arose of plants that could move on their own, and strange creatures with even stranger abilities. In a valley of unknown location they called home. Some people speculated that someone had genetically enhanced their subjects, and with aid of the smallest mechanical things one could imagine, they changed the animals and plants into monstrosities and fears. With mounting rumors had begun to manifest themselves on a more of a religious belief. Those green Techs had finally cultivated the perfect balance between wild and tech, making a dying ecostructure stronger than anything even they thought was possible. For years they tried to tame what they had created, but all their endeavors turned feral. And with no way to control it, they had no choice but to seal it away forever. They left their compound in the desert and moved south, rebuilding their home city. Using the knowledge that they had gathered, they were able to make civilization begin anew, synthesizing everything they needed. Food, water, clothes, building materials, and as well were able to replenish the air they needed for breathing, confining themselves to cities and only able to venture out for short periods of time. In time they had forgotten where the valley was, but for one phrase from a child's story of a valley hidden in the desert where magical creatures and plants ruled, and veiled by an invisible bush that only the just were able to walk through without harm, marked by an outcropping of stones and tucked inside a small group of rocks big enough to conceal a small paradise, but not so big to warrant anyone to find shelter or investigate. In this child's story, it tells of a child lost in the desert, and near death she fell into a trance during a storm. Walking as though drawn toward an unknown force, she found herself in a valley of a lush, wet forest. She was surrounded by mythical creatures that fed and nourished her back to life. Living an enchanted life, she grew to be powerful, with the magic of this land that had taken her as its own child. In time she felt it was right for her to leave and repay the kindness of the valley by finding new areas that she could propagate for the forest and bring life back to the world outside the valley. She took seed from the valley and went out to the world. After many years of travel, she had planted many a valley to become fertile and prosperous. Life came back to the world. Plants and animals were again becoming plentiful. The air was again breathable. As generations passed, the people became strong again. The vision she had for the world she was trying to create was not coming to fruition. The plants and animals didn't talk to her as the ones she grew up with. They seemed to be just what they were. Plants and animals, she could talk to them as long as she was touching them, but she was the only one that could do this, and she had helped the world come back from the dead. But it wasn't the magical world she thought she was planting the seeds for. Out of all the people she met, she was the only one that had special abilities, and seemingly being ageless, she had traveled the world many times, never to find another like her. Till one day, she found a farmer sitting in the field with his hands buried in the dirt and mumbling some words she couldn't make out. Clouds formed over his fields, and a light rain began to fall. Once the field had enough water, the clouds parted away for the sun. Once the sun's rays fell onto the ground, and the entire field erupted with life, plants growing a month in just a few minutes. He stood up, brushing off the dirt and mud, walking back to his house. Intrigued, she went up to him and asked how he was able to do such a feat. He simply answered, he was always able to do it. And as far as he knew, he was the only one who could do it. The two talked for hours, and finally she felt she had to share her ability. She took his hand and walked him to a horse. While holding his hand, she touched the head of the horse. He was able to hear the horse's thoughts too. Amazed at this, he carried a conversation with his horse, asking him every question he could, thinking that perhaps he was dreaming. Equally so, the horse seemed excited and about being able to talk to his keeper and inform the farmer of everything the horse liked, and also took the chance to say a few things that the horse most definitely didn't like. The farmer, laughing at the thought of being put in place by his horse. But the experience did impact the farmer tremendously. Then she did the same for a nearby tree. And again, the farmer was at awe at the prospect of talking to not only an animal but plants as well. Amazing, he exclaimed, time and time again. They finished a grand tour of all the plant life and animal life on the farm, ending with his dog, which, funny enough, was the simplest of all conversations. About all he could get from the dog was, feed me, pet me, and play. The lady told the farmer that pets that become dependent on people never grow past their childlike state. Not wanting for much, they never learn anything more than the commands that their owner teaches them, and they live a simple and happy life. And if you wanted a real conversation with the proper dog, then they would have to find a wolf or a dog gone feral. Cats, on the other hand, just ignore them both, pompous and defiant to the end. They stayed together for many years, and during that time they fell in love and had a child. They named their child Shane. End of chapter 3. Fall of Valroona, Book 1 of Many, by my dear friend Tiberious JC. Chapter 4. Ancestries Lost and Found. Valsu, Valsu. What is it, man? Responded Valsu. Someone found the first valley. They found it, you say? Valsu said in a flat, dead tone. Yes, we were on a survey looking for the entrance, as we had for many years. We saw a man walking in the desert. He walked right past us. We tried to talk to him, but he was completely delirious. He couldn't see or hear us. He was walking like if there was a storm, but the day was clear. You say he found the entrance? Yes, he did, I think. He was walking straight across from where we have always thought the entrance would be. But that's just more open desert. I know. We have been all over that area, nothing but sand and flat wasteland. You make no sense. Get to it. I am. Like I said, he was walking out away from the group of rocks we surmised the valley would be. Yes. And it looked as though he was walking in a storm. Yes. We watched him walking away into the desert. Your point? Well, he disappeared. He what? Vanished. That means nothing. You must have imagined it. Or perhaps he fell in a hole. We thought the same thing. A few of us ran over to investigate. There was no hole. But one of the men was impaled by an invisible thing. He was killed? No, he impaled himself with what I think is a thorn. Holding out two empty hands as though holding a weapon, he presented the invisible thorn to Velsu. Velsu reached out with skepticism and grasped the thorn. So it's true. Velsu's face changed from hard to almost childlike expression, but it was supposed to be in a small grouping of rocks, such as the ones we were looking at. We said the same thing. We searched everywhere. After an hour of investigating, the area that our man was impaled no longer exists. What? You say no longer exists? Yes, as though it never was. We surmised that the only reason we were able to save this thorn was because we didn't take it out until we'd brought him home so we could properly extract it without damaging it. Good thinking, replied Valsu. From the little testing we did, it seems indestructible. Well, how then did it break off? I was thinking of that, sir, and I theorized that it came from a plant that's supple when alive, sharp, but fragile. Yet when a piece such as this breaks off, it instantly hardens to what we can tell is harder than anything we have ever studied. Really? Yes. I believe it's a defensive reaction. You don't say. I do. We think it's so no one can find out its secrets. Ah, I see. It does perplex one as to the oddity of it all. Indeed. Send our best investigators and trackers. Set up camp. Stay there as long as it takes, even if your children's children are all that's left. Find the entrance. With a dumbfounded look on Sirik's face, he walked out as though it would be the last time he would ever see his home again. The faithful servant obeyed his leader. For 20 years, Sirik was vigilant in his search for the entrance. Through all these years, his hope began to fade. Strange storms from seemingly nowhere would erupt. He lost so many men and women that the leader himself came to see why so many had died. But by the time he arrived, every man had completely lost his mind. Those who had survived fled from the area, claiming a curse had taken the veil. As the leader rode nearer to the encampment, women lay wailing to the skies, some beaten to unrecognizable shapes. Men were torn apart, partially self-inflicted, and by what seemed packs of beasts. A cold flush of fear rushed through his entire being. He entered just inside the veil encampment. Atop his horse, he could see the absoluteness of what had conspired. It was all burnt, as though an army had come through and razed it to the ground. With a booming voice, he called for Sirik. Where are you, boy? No sound or movement was made. He's gone. Now slumped in his saddle, he turned to leave. Behind him, a pail of burnt rubble, which was at one time the command center. A charred and mangled hand worked its way into the air. It shook in pain as it screamed for help. Another hand grasped it, and another. Out of the embers, a body was pulled free. Sirik, my boy. The man held his deformed son to him, picking him up and carrying him to a cart. Physicians, fix him now. His doctors falling over themselves to do his bidding. Men, search everywhere. Bring all the survivors here. We must get them home quickly. Elsie felt a squeeze on his hand, not realizing he was still holding Sirik's hand. Sirik's eyes were open. Cursed words as twisted and burnt as his body oozed from his lips. Sirik somehow grabbed Valsu by the collar, pulling him close to him. The land is cursed. Run! Run now! At that moment, a fierce sandstorm erupted and engulfed the encampment. Valsu called for his men to flee, but his voice dwindled in the storm and became more and more of a light whisper. Thunder and lightning enveloped the skies, dark clouds giving birth to a deluge of torrent rain. Flash floods washed clean the desert impure and unnatural inhabitants. Miles away, Valsu hanging on to the cart with all his worth, washed up to the shores of the once dry lake that was next to the city. A handful of men and women survived the tragedy and came to Valsu and Sirik's aid. Darren, wake up. I'm awake, boy. What do you want? Do you smell that? It smells kind of like roast pig. Darren's eyes widened a bit. No, boy. Roast pig doesn't smell like that. Darren jumped up and was running towards the smell. The boy gathered their things as fast as he could and did his best to keep up. They ran in what was the straightest line that man had ever taken through the woods. As they ran, the smell changed to an utmost putrid fog. They came to the end of the woods and Darren stopped, panting. He leaned up against a tree. Looking out, he saw a village ablaze. No sounds but the fire emanated from it. Darren gathered his steel and walked slowly and with purpose. The boy now close in tow. The carnage was unbearable for the boy. Burnt bodies of the villagers and their livestock littered the ground. He collapsed to the ground next to the lady holding a child. Get up, boy, there's nothing we can do. They're all dead. Let them be. They walked through the village to the main hall. The once brightly painted adobe style buildings with robust columns were black with soot, charred murals gone to dust. Giant holes were burned through the walls and roofs of the buildings. Inside, many of the holes burned into the ground below. No, it can't be. What can't be, Darren? Bringers of the sun, beings that have harnessed the sun's beams concentrated to such an extreme that when anything is exposed to it, the rays not only burn holes, but they blast holes with a light brighter and hotter than that of the sun. It's said that just seeing this light will burn your soul. And it's said that anyone seeing it or seeing the carnage left behind their village was sure to be next. I've heard of these things in battle. The great elder called the great mechanical beings the hells, with hell's inferno burning within. But these are ancient, were thought to be all but extinct, things of legend, nothing more than stories to keep unruly children in line. We must hasten our travel to Valroona. I can only hope that the bringers aren't headed in that direction. Come, boy, we go now. With a few words and a gesture, Darren conjured up a couple of steeds. They mounted off, and off they rode to get news to Valsu and Valsu the Fourth, to hopefully assemble their army and consult the Clarividente, a group that took the name from an old text found eons ago. Those who see all and know all. They grew to such high acclaim that no one in power does anything without their permission first. Once thought as good, honest people that had not but the best of intentions for all people, had, as all groups that come to power, become corrupt and hungry for mastery over all humankind. But to say such things would bring death to one, even having said it in a flash of frustration at their own life's situation. Since the tragedy, the northern camp 4 generations ago, leaving the ruler Valsu clasping his son on the shores of the now Moro lakes caused from a curse of the Vale, the city of Valroona has prospered. Though tragic, the flooding of the dry lake beds opened Valroona to a richer soil and waterways that covered 68 square mile area. After exploring, found flowing past other towns and cities to the ocean, making trade easier. Fish from the ocean swam to the northern streams to spawn, giving a new source of food and fertilizer for their fields. The land around the lakes and river came lush with trees and other useful vegetation. The rain, at first frightening to the people, now look upon as a source of life, and is waited with in anticipation each year. On this particular year, just as the celebrations of bringing in the rain began at Valroona, two strangers had entered, a short, stocky man and a boy. The man, dressed in outdated garb, tattered and road-weary, beard and hair, had most likely not seen a blade since he was a young man. Handsome eyes, yet a hard look, as though to pierce one's soul. The only thing harder than his eyes were his face, and his hands as granite. There were no weapons that could be seen, and he walked with purpose, walking such as a man with nothing to hide would. The boy doubled to keep up, but the man looked to be cut from the same lineage. Not yet as tempered from years of life's tribulations as the man, but still had a stern and hard look about him. As they walked through the streets, people paid no attention to them, with the exception of vendors that lined the streets on both sides, whose voices would tout of their goods to passerbyers. Their clothing in blues, brightly colored, the sweet smell of candies and pastries being made, and as well as meats dried and spiced, not to mention vegetables, hot, buttery breads, and a myriad of ales and other brews for the choosing. As night fell upon the city, it took a carnival look and feel. Many alleys and other streets had games, other clothing, and all types of miscellaneous merchandise available. The streets were well lit, the buildings just as bright, with street performers dancing and singing. Music came from many of the buildings, and one would easily be able to find any carnal knowledge they wished for the price in the city. Valroona was most definitely a merchant's paradise, a place that one could, if they had the know, become very wealthy. Surprisingly, the whole city seemed to be free of the darker element. No guards, no fights. If there was any thefts, one would have a hard time knowing of it. No one called out for guards at any time. Eerie, said Darren. What's that? The boy asked. The seemingly lack of any apparent thievery or skullduggery is unnatural in a place such as this. The streets are clean and too well manicured for any city. Last time I was here, though big, it was a typical city along with normal problems of a city like this. The two walked through the city. Darren studied the people. Everyone seemed happy and enjoying themselves very much, but he became more in tune with the environment. He could tell behind those eyes lay a darker truth. Anytime he would make eye contact with a person, they had a sad, slave look, defeated and sorrowful, and they would immediately look away, staring at the ground, or just to not curse themselves for trouble. He reached out with his mind in search for a deeper truth. In his mind, he could hear thousands of people pleading, screaming desperately for help, becoming overwhelmed with depression and helplessness. Darren had a cold point in the center of his being. It grew within. He then felt it. Death. Unsurmountable death. The city oozed with it. Every small shadow or crack pierced him with that feeling one gets when one sees a living soul leaves its shell. By all that is, exclaimed Darren, they're dead. What? The boy asked. Don't panic, boy. Stay calm. And stay close. Yes, sir. No one seemed to notice the change in Darren and the boy. They just kept on as all was good and quite normal. We must hasten to a room. After a few more minutes, they reached the inn they came for, keeping a deadpan face, that of which even the best of gamblers would have easily been fooled by. They gathered their keys and registered for the rooms, ordered their food and drink, and took their dinner to their rooms. The accommodations they had received by choice had 2 rooms, and a small common room joining them in the center with a table, with a few chairs about the room, with a hearth already lit for warmth. Once inside, and Darren felt they were in a secure place, he sat in a chair next to the fire, rubbing his hand and arms like a man frozen to the core, his hard, stern features now soft and full of worry. He looked up at Travis. Boy, the days of the prophets are upon us. What do you mean, Darren? There have been no signs. Yes, there have, boy. The ravens flying such as they did, and don't forget the village. And now the City of Light, underneath the thin veil of happiness and prosperity, lays in evil not seen for generations. Valroona has fallen without a fight. I saw the signs. I hoped we had more time. I was mistaken. We have less time than I believe we needed. We have less time than I believe we need. The Bringers are somehow back and are here to finish what they had started. What do you know of the Bringers of the Sun, boy? Just what you told me after we found the village, replied Travis. You need to know the whole story. We have little time, but you need to know what we are up against. Terem Bortepi, a man born in the days of Wild. When the world was near completeness of healing, the Wild had taken over most of the world, and mankind was in danger of becoming extinct. Tiran, one of the last techs, grew up in the last tech stronghold that was being overtaken by the flora and fauna, and for some unknown reason turned the land into a vicious and deadly forest, with unimaginable creatures and plant life with a voracious appetite. Constant battle between men and wild went on for years, the men pushing back and holding their ground with fire and blade were slowly losing ground. Darkness took over the city they were defending, the men losing hope and the will to fight overcome the population. What they didn't know was that Tedden, with the knowledge of his ancestors, had been building an army not before seen, one of tech, mechanical beings with the ability to harness the power of the sun and bring much devastation to the world, both that of man and wild. Tedden sacrificed thousands of his own kind to build this army, for inside each person he found a tech that he knew that was the answer to all of their strife. This thing he found was what his people had infused with their very being. It was the reason they could live for so long and regenerate faster than one should. He studied these beings and realized that they were alive and autonomous. He also surmised that these people were indeed man-made machines, and he found a way to control them. With his tech, he could build anything he could imagine. The unfortunate fact of it was he couldn't keep anyone he harvested for these machines alive, but he could leave enough in people to control their bodies. Those soulless, mindless beings, he had made them have an outward appearance of a lively, uplifted people, seemingly willing to do anything he commanded. He harvested the bulk of the city's populace and had an army and workforce he could control without question. With his new power over the people, he had them mine below the city for materials he needed to build his army so that he could control over the land. So driven he was. To this end, he felt no remorse for this tragic act. In fact, he believes that the people were happier and healthier for what he had done. With a force as large as this, it took one summer's season to complete 1,000 machines that were as tall as the walls and trees around cities. These machines, lumbering and heavy, moved with long strides of the legs below a large ball-like body, with a hole in front that seemed unlike a cannon, and had a sun-like glow emitting from them. They had arms, some with claws, some with saws, some with axes. On top of these machines was what looked like a band of light wrapped around it, which the light would scan the area for its foes, capped with a mushroom-shaped top. Terran had the machines surround the city. Once in place, all 1,000 of them let out beams of light, the cannons in their chests, and lay waste a mile of wilderness, the circumference of the city. In a flash of heat and light, life was wiped from the planet. Moving through the wild, these machines, these bringers of the sun, moved out melodically, following old-grown over roads, ripping, cutting, and burning their way to other towns and cities. Those who opposed them were eradicated. Those who surrendered to them were processed, and as those from Teren Portepi's city, building a vast city, combining the other cities and villages into itself, and Teren city grew and became more powerful, with buildings that scraped the sky, tapering down to the small buildings surrounding the outskirts of the city covered. Years it took for the city to grow to this size, all while a man living on top of a mountain watched it from the start. Angered by this, he slowly worked his way down the mountain, gathering seeds and animals to aid him. He had birds and bugs of all sorts to scout the city. He brought winds to blow the seeds to find a root hold anywhere they possibly could. For many years he spied on them. During those years he plotted and planned. Often he would listen in to conversations throughout the city. Sitting miles away, he would take a thread of a spider silk and place it to his ear, and was able to hear any sound that was made near a thread left by the spiders. The spiders built a network of webs and lines in every nook and cranny, both above and below the city. He then placed another thread to his eye and was able to look through any spider's eyes as if he were a spider, or any bug or animal within contact of a thread. When he found a person of interest, he would take note of them and learn their routines. The man slowed the growth of the city by sabotaging main lines of communication, water, and waste. From time to time, some of the plants and bugs, such as termites, that had been growing under the streets and in the walls and the ceilings of the buildings would force those buildings to collapse, most thinking it caused from degradation from weather and earthquakes that were becoming more frequent. All the while, an unseen force of nature was growing in and around the city. The tech Tedden had infused was, in fact, using him. Unbeknownst to him, his empire grew and the people grew weak. Though happy, they withered and died. Their souls remaining in the city, living day to day, not knowing their fate. Even Tedden growing weary, his life force stretched thin, was ignored by Tedden. Instead, he pushed on, forcing himself on to become as powerful as he could, stealing the very life from his people to prolong his own. He was bent on ridding the world of the treacherous flora and fauna to reclaim what he thought was his birthright as a human. And thus the second age of war between Tech and Green had begun. War? What do you mean? We aren't at war? Travis, looking pale, forced, and panicked at Darren. The war had started a generation ago. My father told me, and now I'm telling you. We didn't know the extent of it. And also, it's believed that Tedden had died, opening the path for the bloodline of Valsu to reclaim their place as rulers. My father fought with Valsu III against Tedden and his mech army. The city was thought to have been saved and the people safe, but Tedden's body was never found after the last battle. He was assumed to have burned in the fire and collapse of his palace. It seems that he may have lived, for the people are in the state that they are, and the signs are clear enough to me that an army has been risen again. Oh no, Darren spoke. Confusion flushed over Travis's face. Darren looked at him and quietly said, if Tedden is back, and his army is back, that means... What does that mean, Darren? Said Travis. He's back as well, he said in a whispery voice. Who? Replied Travis. Shane the Green. He was the man from the mountain. He was responsible for the world's wildlife as it was. A treaty was made with him when our people of Green had joined his cause to stop Tedden. He promised we would know peace as long as Tedden's knowledge was never used against him, or his nature ever again. We had known peace all this time, now it's starting again. Shane the Green did warn us that if it were to happen again, he would put an end to all human life and give the world to its rightful sorts, that of the plants and animals. What do we do, Darren? Asked Travis. What we must do. We must do what must be done. We have no choice but to find and end Tedden and his knowledge, or else be at the mercy of a broken promise. Oh my god, that's the end. What? There's no more? What? What? Was that it? Oh. I thought it was longer than this. I was about to take a bathroom break too. What?